Resident Evil was not the first survival horror franchise, or the smartest, or even the scariest. Over the past 25 years, however, it has proved itself to be the most iconic and powerful of all the subgenre's big names, defining and redefining the verbs and vibes of a survival horror again and again. 1992's Alone in the Dark might have blazed the trail ahead of Resident Evil, but by the time the first Resident Evil came out in 1996, the Alone in the Dark franchise had already used up its creative momentum, and no reboot ever succeeded in reviving that series. Silent Hill was more clever and effective in terms of true horror, but was less mutable and adaptable as a game franchise, less willing to radically alter its direction and make creative gambles, devolving then into sequels which never truly eclipsed the early titles. Not so for Resident Evil. 25 years after its debut, Resident Evil games are better than they've ever been, uniting amazing remakes of the original games with lushly produced new games that take long-running franchise tropes and modernize them beautifully. I've hardly ever played any franchise with such amazing, fascinating peaks and valleys of quality, intention, and execution. A history of Resident Evil is necessarily a history of survival horror in general, the franchise acting as a driving force to spur both imitators and deliberately contrasting designs. It moves from innovation so powerful it basically codified what survival horror still is today, to corporate stagnation, to AAA excess and bloat so exponentially bad it's almost self-parodic. Then, to an introspective recentering that allowed the franchise to move back towards excess anew, smarter this time, more controlled. And along the way, side project after side project experimenting in the margins, playing with and reconfiguring the tropes in ways later reflected back in the main number titles. I found the games so compelling that I played them all back to back to back over about 2 months without really needing a long break, so well-paced and varied they are from title to title. By never abandoning the B-movie frame, even working with AAA budgets, even the Resident Evil games that are atrociously bad are bad in that popcorn-munching, can't-believe-your-own-eyes way that something like Wes Craven's Wishmaster is, just dated and weird and dumb enough to be tremendous fun. There are 8 primary Resident Evil games, and this video covers 15, plus 3 remakes, while still having left out quite a few titles. There are light gun games, a game for the Game Boy Color, multiplayer-only titles, whatever Operation Raccoon City is. Can this video really call itself thorough, ignoring them? I think so. There's always deeper you can go. You can get yourself well and truly lost in the franchise's prolific output. That's been a lot of why it took me so many years to actually play the franchise. I had no idea where to even start. I played them in narrative order, but organized this video in order of release because of how many years and how many styles of game design you bounce between across the span of releases. Resident Evil is an intimidatingly huge and confusingly labeled franchise on top of its individual merits as actual games. It's not required of you to play all of them to be a fan, or even to get the best experience from the modern franchise. While I'm sure Resident Evil would prefer me to describe it as a journey into the heart of terror, the experience of playing all of the games and their glories and gambles is closer to being on a roller coaster of game design. You stay on the track, but it certainly doesn't seem like it will, climbing to the tallest heights before plunging directly downward and around a blind corner. Like all good roller coasters, what's to come is built off the tension of that long first climb to the top, clacking inch by inch to a peak of quality, at which point the momentum and inertia will take over and then the ride really begins. Even in 1996, little was truly original about Resident Evil, or Biohazard as its alternate title. It began life explicitly as a remake of a 1989 horror title called Sweet Home. Tokuro Fujiwara, Sweet Home's creator, approached a man named Shinji Mikami about remaking it with better technology for a more immersive and effective horror experience. Huge chunks of Sweet Home still exist in the foundation of the first game. Sweet Home has a team of multiple protagonists with unique items investigating puzzle box mansions for valuable artwork, fighting monsters with a limited inventory, fighting environmental traps, and getting frequent game overs. It's a top-down RPG in that Super Nintendo style, though, so it makes perfect sense that Fujiwara longed for a more viscerally frightening perspective. Famously, there's a widely repeated story that Fujiwara chose Shinji Mikami specifically because Mikami was not a huge horror person. He was scared by a lot. And as such, Mikami was better suited to create something genuinely frightening than someone more blasé about it. Fujiwara wanted Mikami to create a game where the poor guy scared himself constantly, and Mikami went about that mandate with great creative diligence. These two things together form the foundation of what's so compelling about the original game. It used a basic template for horror that was already proven. It was a simple structure that anyone could pick up on right away, even if the controls took a little getting used to. Then the creator of that template handed the keys over to someone with a fresh set of eyes, someone who could mutate Sweet Home's art-filled mansion into a much stranger, more immediately terrifying world. Shinji Mikami has said that he lifted the idea for the fixed camera angles directly from the Alone in the Dark titles, but the feature became more associated with Resident Evil because of its more masterful, unnerving use of it. Not only was an improvement over Sweet Home's SNES limitations, the creative choice to layer simple 3D models over pre-rendered environments allowed the early Resident Evil games to look more impressive and much more lush than many of the full 3D games released for the original PlayStation's contemporaries. It's a fascinating bit of technical sleight of hand. On the surface, the game isn't much more complex than something like Myst, a slideshow of still images with interactive puzzle elements. However, enemies, the player, and objects are rendered in a more active way. They're the only live objects. Because of how undemanding this arrangement is on the hardware, they can be rendered clearly with high fidelity. While the very first game has the feel of a prototype in its art style, by the second and third Resident Evil, it had evolved into an extremely distinct style that gave the games a strong identity, visible in screenshots alone. You can tell an early Resident Evil game immediately apart from a Silent Hill or an Alone in the Dark by scene composition, by colors used, by the angles chosen for the fixed perspective. The early Resident Evils have a well-deserved reputation for being cheap-ass, cheeseball productions when it comes to voice acting, script, and general plotting. This just adds to the mystique, because despite genuinely having some of the worst dialogue of all time, none of it can touch the colossal sense of style that even 25 years later still oozes from the dilapidated walls of the Spencer Mansion. The game's structure has less in common with modern digital game design than with a classic tabletop RPG module, which even tracks when you consider that Sweet Home was an experimental RPG of sorts. Taking place in a sprawling manner with a large outer estate and hidden basement laboratory, with multiple paths to success through a carefully arranged series of interlocking puzzles and dangerous, unpredictable enemy placement, the mansion is closer to Castle Ravenloft than to Castle Wolfenstein. You could absolutely run the entirety of Resident Evil 1 as a tabletop campaign if you cared to, or have a very similar experience with a board game like Betrayal at House on the Hill. The video game portion is a series of systems meant to proctor the module for you to provide friction and failure on top of what's essentially an absolutely gigantic lockbox puzzle. The 2002 remake, which we'll talk about in more detail later, even pitches its difficulty differences this way. Are you playing for the challenge, for the friction, or are you here primarily for a puzzle, a mountain climb, or a nature walk? Difficulty in the original is defined instead by character selection. Sweet Home had 5 protagonists you had to switch between, all of whom were critical to success. But Resident Evil 1 splits itself across 2 contrasting protagonists with slightly different, wholly separate paths through the mansion. Easy mode, and this is a bit of a misnomer because the first game is quite punishing at all times, is played with Jill Valentine, a member of a special police group called STARS. Investigating disappearances in the Arklay Mountains, the STARS team is forced by zombie dogs inside of a mysterious mansion where they split up and meet violent ends. Mechanically, what makes Jill's mode easy is flexibility. She's weaker, not able to withstand as much cumulative damage, but she has 8 inventory slots and a lockpick used to acquire extra ammunition and extra supplies. She also has access to a grenade launcher, which deals huge damage to the game's later bosses and enemies. It's a fair balance. You can explore more effectively, for longer, but you're more vulnerable the whole time. Hard mode has you in the shoes of Chris Redfield, who would go on to become the most consistently featured character in the whole Resident Evil franchise. What makes it hard is less extra difficulty than it is extra inconvenience. Chris only has 6 inventory slots. A weapon and ammo take up 2 slots. At a given time, you're likely to have at least 2 story items to juggle for the puzzles. Chris can take a lot of damage, but he isn't able to get a shotgun until the mid-game and doesn't have another heavy hitter until the end-game, where you have to solve bonus puzzles to reveal the magazine. Ammo is tighter, backtracking occurs more frequently, increasing your exposure. There is more necessity to have a plan, which Jill doesn't really need with her greater flexibility. I played the 2002 remake first, as Jill, so I thought that I knew what to expect with Chris in the original. I still didn't. This first iteration of the mansion is smaller, more straightforward than the later ones, but it's also much more cool about errors. I had to restart the game several times as Chris before finding a path where I wasn't running out of ammo at the transition from the early game to the mid-game. There are multiple correct solutions, but some are a lot more difficult and a lot more dangerous than others, though all solutions will eventually wind their way through the same puzzles in some order. In this way, the difficulty is basically fixed between the characters. The mansion itself, the trial and error process of conquering it, this is the heart of the game that exists independently of both characters' mechanical ability. Jill and Chris, their respective modes, are just angles of approach to the same content, different balances of strength and restriction that feel more dynamically complementary than just easy or hard. This dual protagonist approach has taken the Resident Evil series to some of its highest highs and lowest lows, and it's right here at the very beginning of this tradition stands. In the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Indy and the villain meet a supernatural knight who gives them a test to identify the true Holy Grail from a wide selection of cups and goblets. The villain chooses something flash and gaudy, a grail for a king, not a carpet, and the knight looks at him with a sadly dire expression and says, "You have chosen poorly." This precedes a spectacular death on the villain's part. That scene contains the root of what makes survival horror so exciting and meaningful as a subgenre. In a room full of glittering prizes, there is only one choice that won't just kill you outright, and making that choice correctly feels like quite an accomplishment. Resident Evil has more than one correct choice at a given time, generally, but at every moment and with every action, there is a danger of choosing poorly. Choice is more important than reflex in the game, by a huge margin. In fact, the combat is some of the least active or acrobatic in all of action gaming. Combat is designed to interface more with atmosphere than with player skill, and indeed the game awards you based on time to complete rather than kill count, valuing the correct order of choices more highly than the most comprehensively destructive path. The style of combat here in the early games is impossible to separate from the choice to use pre-rendered backgrounds. Myst or Riven or that style of adventure puzzler just expects you to sit back and go, there's no reflex involved. How would you with a still image? The mechanical style of early Resident Evils is often divisive among fans because they're quite awkward compared to modern controls to make it work with the pre-rendered backgrounds. For the first games, they have what's called tank controls, which isn't actually very descriptive. What it means is that you can only move two directions, forwards, backwards. You turn with left and right, but it's a separate process, not like the full circle of diagonal motion a thumbstick would give you in modern games. To fire a weapon, you have to stop moving and ready it to fire. It's much more slow-paced and deliberate at every step of the process than modern navigation or combat, which, like most modern things, is designed to just work without much thought going into it on your part. And, admittedly, I've never achieved any kind of actual skill with the old tank controls. They are always some degree of difficult for me. It didn't take very long at all, though, for me to appreciate what they added to the atmosphere. The first Resident Evil was originally going to have a first-person perspective, but pivoted away to this style, at least in part because they're able to do more with less from a technical standpoint, designing it this way. They're able to have much higher fidelity of environment than first-person would have ever allowed at the time. In practice, it is artistically so much more than that. The fixed camera perspectives create curated moods, long and uncomfortable angles that create anxiety and tension, all on their own, angles that hide enemies and allow for jump scares that a first-person perspective would have revealed too early. It's able to maintain a huge amount of what's basically cinematic control over the game with this method. This is what makes Resident Evil so ahead of its time in certain respects. Gaming in the 90s was much more mechanically focused than the story-driven, spectacle-heavy games of today because of the widespread technical limitations back then. Mechanical engagement was what made them special, what made them better than a movie or a book in certain respects, whereas it was difficult back then for the medium to compete with movies or books on their home turfs of complex characterization or visual impact. Today, it is all so much more mixed together. Resident Evil 1, back in 1996, made the very bold choice to make major mechanical sacrifices for the sake of visual style and impact, for the sake of atmosphere. It was a huge gamble. It was also the reason we're still talking about it 25 years later. The slow-paced, extremely deliberate control and combat systems are really the only even slightly graceful way to add a layer of immersion and action to what is still just a slideshow maze. The perspective shifts in that maze, though, are so well-placed and well-timed that it helps keep the game from feeling as dated as the art style has become. The mansion conveys its size and scale in a way that's surprisingly robust, seeing your character in close-up and long-shot both, watching your own traversal in such a voyeuristic way, having that artificial amplification to the uncertainty that lurks around every corner by adding extra corners, makes the mansion feel absolutely complete. Having to stand in one place to fight back makes these camera angles tactical in a fascinating way. Some places are simply more dangerous to stand than others, Often it's useful to retreat to a position where you're facing the camera and letting the enemies walk towards you from the player's own direction. It makes running around a terrible idea. A zombie often lurks right at the hinge of a perspective shift, just waiting for you to cavalierly jog into its arms. Interestingly, Resident Evil 1 is notable for having the simplest and easiest boss fights of the entire franchise. Boss fights are some of the most memorable parts of future games, but here in the original, there seems to be a worry that the awkwardness of the controls would make a complicated fight too much of a demand on the player. So even in Chris Redfield's ostensibly hard mode, the biggest enemies go down extremely quickly if you just keep applying damage and do something more impressive than a pistol. It's almost shockingly easy, and I'm saying this as someone who generally dies 2 or 5 or 10 times against bosses, even just a couple of titles later in the franchise. Resident Evil 1 is hardest in the first half. If you actually live through the first half, generally you have accumulated an advantage strong enough to keep going. However, in that first hour or two, it's extremely easy to get into a situation where you have huge portions of the mansion to explore and no resources to survive that exploration with. That's kind of the appeal of a second run with a second character. Now that you learn how, you can skip the overfamiliar front half to see the more secretive back half of the game. The part of the game where there's mystery in the plot, and not just in the still background. The part of the game where you're finally as dangerous as anything else in the house. Even if there's nothing especially supernatural about your particular powers, there's certainly a supernatural satisfaction in blowing apart enormous monsters with a hefty revolver, especially after the extreme duress you're put under for the early hours of the game. Shinji Mikami was insistent that his monsters not be supernatural either. The zombies and creatures and everything odd about the mansion was attributable to a pharmaceutical corporation trying to create bioweapons. Hence, Biohazard as a franchise title, a name they couldn't use in America because it was already taken by a smaller game and a punk band. So they settled on Resident Evil with a Capcom office poll. Even to the developers, it was ridiculous. I think that ended up being a major advantage. Biohazard's good, but it's generic. With a Resident Evil, you're already trying to figure out what the hell they mean by that, and that's 300% more thought than you put into something called Biohazard. It is difficult to overstate just how bad the voice acting and dialogue is here in the early games, and this isn't a franchise where the terrible voice acting and dialogue is a lot of what's famous about the later games. It's jarring, achingly, inhumanly bad in a way that you've never seen before unless you're looking at a deliberate retro crash project. And the fact that this is layered into what's otherwise an excellent and effective horror experience just doubles down on the absurdity of everything. There are a lot of early memes that came from it and stuck with the series, mostly with Barry and Jill banter, like the obliviously suggestive, "You were almost a Jill sandwich," or the straightforwardly weird, "Here is a lockpick for you, the master of unlocking." For Chris and his companion Rebecca Chambers, there's less dialogue that's memeable because it's all just grating nonsense. Chambers is like nails on a chalkboard, and she's pretty much always just promising to stay out of the way and be positive, while Chris had his personality surgically removed prior to the start of the game and serves as a square-jaw McJarhead type. At the end, Rebecca Chambers does blow up the facility if she lives that long, but her living that long depends on you telling her to stay put and not try to help out earlier. She's just an odd, extra-connived cliché in a cast populated entirely by hastily drawn characters. The main antagonist, besides the mansion itself, is Albert Wesker, a cool and smooth sunglasses guy, whose one goal in life is to vamp at length about world domination, a goal he will doggedly pursue across a range of sequels as he and Chris become embroiled in one of the world's most laughably stupid rivalries. Resident Evil 1 only rarely delves into cutscenes and dialogue, and thank God for that. But it's interesting how the cheesy nonsense serves as a kind of refuge from the genuine anxiety and apprehension that the rest of the game design can evoke. The camera angles used for navigation are so much more effective and interesting than any of the compositions of the cutscenes that the tension simply never carries over through whatever turgid plot beat those cutscenes convey. They function, then, as breaks, as comic relief, as a moment to put the controller down and say, "Whew, actually advance the damn plot." It doesn't matter what's being said. What matters is that you lived long enough to witness it. Scattered around the mansion are written notes and logs as well, which generally fare much better for writing quality. There are a few of them that are actually interesting and unnerving, and cumulatively they paint a fascinating picture of a corporation of underlings falling over each other hand over foot to please executives who had well and truly lost their grip on reality itself. It is very cool to go from seeing the mansion full of indescribable horrors, from thinking something had gone terribly wrong, only to find out down in the laboratories that every monster is labeled and named in a slideshow, that all of this was deliberate and planned, including the outbreak, that these monsters were on the verge of being given a market value. The final enemy is the Tyrant, the ultimate bioweapon, who you need to have gotten a good ending to even face in a final boss fight at all. Doing this requires extra thorough exploration, finding 2 hidden MO discs, plus a more obvious third one, and then using them on optional equipment in the last section of the game to unlock the other unchosen protagonist from a hidden cell. If you save Jill, and Chambers sets the mansion to explode, if you're playing as Chris anyway, you get an arena fight with a Tyrant on the helipad from which you were supposed to escape. Eventually, the helicopter pilot drops a rocket launcher, the final tool for the final boss. This began a tradition Mikami carried over even to his own horror franchise, The Evil Within, that persists in almost every Resident Evil game, where this final moment is resolved not through grand theatrics, but with high explosives. I thought, early on encountering this trope, that it was a break in atmosphere and mood. I've since come to feel that a break in atmosphere and mood was exactly the idea. You only get the rocket launcher once you've basically already won. This is your prize. It's a victory firework in your honor. Is this good horror? No. It is satisfying game design, though. And after such tremendous repetition of the trope, I think I finally developed a kind of fondness for it. It was cheesy even in 1996, so to keep on doing it for 2.5 decades is a real commitment to the bit. That's what's so impressive about the first Resident Evil, on the whole. It established its own cliches and its own brand identity so strongly, so immediately, that no matter how wildly the later games would differ, there was always a core of recognizable nostalgic familiarity to them that connected straight back to their very beginning. The early importance and impact of Resident Evil on gaming and games culture was cemented by how the sequel immediately surpassed the original in nearly every way. Even after playing the remake, the original 1998 version of Resident Evil 2 is a triumph of horror game design. Its scope is much larger, its art is much more visually compelling, and its pacing is even better than the first game. It also used the dual protagonist system in a much more fascinating way. Instead of primarily mechanical differences, Leon and Claire experience entirely different plot points between their playthroughs, and are designed to be played one right after the other. It introduces the idea of an A and B playthrough. Your A experience, whichever character you choose, is either on the standard or easy difficulty. Then whichever protagonist you didn't choose becomes available for the B playthrough, where the order of items and enemies is remixed to become a little trickier. So instead of one character being easy and the other being hard, a second playthrough is made more interesting and compelling because it has both new narrative content and new mechanical twists. An easy mode playthrough transfers to the B playthrough as well. After having been frustrated with getting jammed up by my poor inventory management choices so much in the previous game, I tried the easy mode in this one, and I actually regret playing it that way. It adds 120 extra handgun bullets and 3 first aid kits to your inventory, as well as making enemies a little easier to take down. This seems like a minor tweak as far as difficulty goes, but as the game goes on, it significantly changes the character of the survival horror experience. The fixed difficulties of the early games have tightly planned peaks and valleys of vulnerability, where the amount of resources you have ranges from barely enough to not nearly enough. In the first game, the winding and freeform nature of the Spencer Mansion created extra friction because of how many inefficient or incorrect routes you might end up taking, how that could tax the limited resources available to you, to the point where you simply can't keep exploring and defend yourself at the same time. Resident Evil 2 corrected for that by not altering the difficulty, but by tweaking the level design. The mazes and puzzles of Resident Evil 2 are much more segmented, requiring a more controlled order of operations that the B playthrough can then mix. This allows for inventory enemy balance to also be more controlled, to the point where it hits a kind of Goldilocks rhythm, not too generous, not too scarce, allowing for some error while still punishing major mistakes and applying mechanical pressure throughout. It only takes 9 extra portions of handgun ammunition to let me accumulate such a massive inventory advantage that I was never pressured and harried in the same way that I'd enjoyed in the first game. In nearly any other zombie-killing game, I would use up 120 bullets in the first hour or two of play, and never even remember that I had them in the first place. But the thing about Resident Evil-style survival horror, the classic style, is that it actually is a delicate balance of progression, where successes and failures echo across your playthrough. Save a lot of ammo through clever dexterous play early on, and the bosses will just roll over for you. Burn a lot of resources of the horde, and you'll need to be much more exact when it comes to the climactic scripted moments. Eventually, Things tip in one direction or another towards success or towards failure, as your instances of each begin to tally and you exhaust the environment of the supplies you need to continue. The tension comes from not knowing for so long whether that advantage will materialize. The thrill is in having manifested that advantage despite the odds. 9 free ammo stacks. That's all it takes to throw off the whole system. It's tempting, I know, to say, oh god, a 90s game, let's turn the arbitrary cruelty dial down a couple of ticks, and I figured that was going to be the case here too. I was wrong. Resident Evil 2 is cruel, yes, but never arbitrarily or unfairly so. It is cruel in service of its own atmosphere, an atmosphere that stands out as being among the greatest out of an entire quarter century's worth of Resident Evil games. What's most immediately impressive is how much greater of a production value it has compared to the original. Laughably low-budget live-action cutscenes have been replaced by 3D rendered cutscenes that must have been wildly expensive. They're able to much better mimic the feel of the disaster movies and zombie movies that influenced the game. The scope has also been dialed out considerably, from a haunted mansion to a full-on zombie apocalypse taking place in the ambiguously American Raccoon City. The police rookie trying to show up for his first day, Leon, meets up with Claire, the sister of the previous game's Chris Redfield. Separated at the very beginning by a tanker explosion, they each then go on to begin their separate routes through the environment, for A and B playthroughs. Obviously, this style of 3D animation used for the cutscenes is pretty dated, but the pacing, the content, the stuff it's trying to convey, still comes across as high-energy fun and often cool. The datedness of it ends up going hand in hand with the deliberate B-movie feel of the plot and dialogue, creating a grindhouse synergy, like you get watching the original Dawn of the Dead over the remake. It's a product of its time in a way that makes it unique and notable among the products of our time, a representative artifact of a lost moment with an artistic aesthetic that will never feel contemporary again. Unlike the first Resident Evil, there's no build-up. We don't begin with dogs and puzzles. We begin with explosions and car chase and running from hordes of the undead from moment one. Then, once you've had 10 minutes or so of gameplay to experience the scope of the disaster, to see the city burn and fall around you a little bit, it's actually right back to the puzzles and the dogs. It is so much more than the original, but it still contains all the truly interesting elements from the original. It's just more filtered and metered through a cinematic presentation.
Oh,
coupled with a stronger art direction for the environments, this more planned, narrative-driven direction gives the game so much more identity than even its predecessor. It feels more visceral, more present tense. The first Resident Evil, even with its atmospheric accomplishments, is a mechanics-first experience. That's one of the reasons its failure states are so much easier to slip into. The progression is more open to player-driven jumbling and mixing up of what's intended to be the ideal order progression, beyond certain event gates. Those event gates happen more often in Resident Evil 2, which not only reduces the chances to seriously screw up your save file, it also keeps the momentum of play moving much faster than the original game. Resident Evil games exist on a spectrum of horror-driven and action-driven design, with the first Resident Evil sitting on the edge of the horror side and, say, Resident Evil 5 sitting on the edge of the action side. The games begin to move steadily from one end of the spectrum to the other before ever beginning to move back again, but they do begin to move backwards in an attempt to find a sweet spot balance between cinematic bombast and self-directed anxiety. Resident Evil 2 might just be that sweet spot. Both the original and its remake are among the best games in the franchise, effortlessly compelling and incessantly stylish. Are they the scariest? Not quite. Compared to the first game, terror is less of a priority. There's more balance between emotions of fear and emotions of power than in the first game. It's a balance that the franchise would spend years trying to find again. While the game is essentially bookended with dramatic action-oriented sequences, the broad majority of the game takes place in a police station that is undoubtedly the least plausible civic building ever put in a video game. The Spencer Mansion got a pass for being unbelievable because that's the trope of the big haunted house. It's filled with secret passages, hidden rooms, and deep madness. When the person designing the house has more money than rationality by a large margin, like with the real-life Winchester Mystery House, you always get a fascinating result. The fact that the Spencer Mansion had an underground laboratory that wasn't just lone wolf mad science, but quarterly budget corporate science was a fantastic twist, an actual twist on the base cliché. The Raccoon City Police Department is the exact opposite, taking a place that is usually, by design, a utilitarian and bland government building, and then adding absurd, gothic, mad science twists that have absolutely no explanation for being there. The remake adds a note that's like, wow, isn't it crazy they built a police station inside an abandoned art museum? But the original doesn't even bother. It just tosses it at you like it's completely normal for all the locks to be themed after playing card suits, for important items to be hidden inside sculptures, and for rare gems the size of your fist to be scattered about inconveniently. It operates on Legend of Zelda dungeon logic, and a lot of the same props of Legend of Zelda even, but blended with what otherwise is still mostly a police station. Locker rooms, offices, interrogation rooms, a jail, an armory, a morgue, a file room, all the administrative necessities. They exist in equal proportions with the video gaming nonsense, which is strange, but not entirely off-putting. There is a strong sense of uncanny, unreality to the entire thing, which also contributes to its strong personality. It's a Japanese game franchise, which makes its fixation on Americana especially entertaining because it gets a lot of the feel right, but struggles, sometimes, with the specifics. Raccoon City, for instance, is a typical Midwestern town that's near a desert, forested mountains, and the city of Chicago. Obviously, that doesn't track, but caring about that failure to track is like saying, you know, guys, I don't think 123 Main Street, Anytown, USA is a real address. Of course it isn't. It's a suggestion in your mind of a certain mid-sized Norman Rockwell-burg with white picket fences and white picket people and a lot of small shops where you can still get a malt soda and have your vacuum cleaner repaired. Well, Leon Kennedy's police uniform, like the STARS uniform Jill Valentine was wearing last game with her little beret, just doesn't look especially American. The cars are from all sorts of different eras and styles, DeLoreans and Cadillacs and Crown Victorias, all crashed and burning in piles of debris. Saying it's pastiche doesn't quite express it, because it's a pastiche of things that don't always go together, and some things that never even were. It's a pastiche where imagination is filling in a whole lot of blanks I take for granted by growing up in the culture. The cumulative result is a setting that feels believable and real because it's so clearly not the world out the window. Because it's such a strange and uncanny otherwhere, an otherwhen, that if Leon can look like this on his first day and no one comments on it, then hey, zombies, why not? This is intensified by the lushness of the backgrounds, absolutely packed with destructive detail. Not only is there more environmental storytelling per square inch than even the best Bethesda RPG, the fixed camera angles frame that storytelling for maximum impact. The game has a baseline of being unsettling and strange, which the game intensifies with its environmentally inappropriate touches of style, all the hallways and rooms of the police station which appear as grander and richer than even the Spencer Mansion. It gives an impression that anything could happen. The chief of police, for instance, is a serial killer and a corporate collaborator who uses the chaos of the zombie apocalypse to sabotage his own town's defense efforts, ensure the destruction of his own police force, and to kill the mayor's daughter so he can preserve her corpse in taxidermy. And all of that is just a small background subplot in Claire's story only. He even has a whole medieval-looking torture chamber complete with a giant wood and wrought iron dungeon door right below his police station office. This would be treated in any other game as being, at the least, notably strange. In Resident Evil 2, it's just a casual detail. One of those things, you know, sometimes the police chief is a bribe-taking, daughter-murdering psychopath with a tremendous dramatic streak. Why not? Many instances of horror media obsessively establish a sense of normalcy and then pull tension from how that normalcy is subverted and eroded into the unthinkable. For Resident Evil, the horror comes from the sense that there never was any normal, and, in turn, anything that happens now will just intensify the insanity already present. No guarantees, no expectations, just a swirling mouth of madness, unhinging its jaw and turning, smiling in your brain. As you get deeper into the game, you move away from human causing the zombie apocalypse and pivot towards the perpetrator's own, the ever-nefarious Umbrella Corporation. Underneath the town sewers is a tram system leading to a sprawling underground laboratory network, the Nest, a much larger laboratory than the previous game. So there's still this secret basement thing going on, but since the scale has expanded to a city over a mansion, the basement expands to an equally metropolitan scale. Over and over, you'll find memos and correspondences and lab reports that all explain the motives behind the events. Apathy and greed. Nothing more. Umbrella has a majority stake in the town, its industries and its services, owns the property and the means of production, and so it goes to follow that if they own the town, they own the townspeople. While Resident Evil 0 adds an especially weird extra backstory for how the virus was initially unleashed, the original backstory was notable for how generally matter-of-fact and blasé the villains of the piece are. Why make a zombie plague? Because it kills a population and leaves the infrastructure mostly intact. It's more civilized in a certain way than a bomb's indiscriminate blast. It's just obviously useful. Sure, it could end a civilization or whatever, but it could also make some serious money, which is the central dilemma of any Defense Department contract. So, luring the STARS team to the mansion, that was one diagnostic test of the weapon system. Obliterating Raccoon City and recording its death throes, well, that can be another. Imagine having actual figures on the citizens devoured per minute to put in the brochure, the free marketing of internationally recognized disasters. On the one hand, no one with an ounce of human compassion would do any of this, but phrased in the clinical ways of the game's scattered files, there is a certain darkly, absurdly comedic sense to it. Even if it destroys the town and hurts the company some, how else to better debut a new arms race for bioweapons than by demonstrating how much a government will need as a countermeasure? It waxes and wanes between different titles, but there is often an undercurrent of political context and commentary to most of the Resident Evil games. Often it's a campy exaggeration of obvious truths, like the bottom dollar weaknesses of the healthcare industry and defense companies, but sometimes it'll toss in a more jagged and direct logic, like cheese on the board. It is an odd mix. Resident Evil is, for the most part, difficult to take seriously, and at its best when it's at its most wild-eyed and manic. By keeping any actual seriousness hidden in the margins like the extra ammunition jammed into drawers and cupboards, it doesn't lean on gravitas it hasn't earned. Ideally, Resident Evil would just build its own commentary like its own believability through granular environmental details, where if you just look at the blood on the walls and trace it back to the source, the whole sequence of events becomes wordlessly clear. This is much more true of the early era than the middle era of the franchise, where the subtext becomes the actual text in a way that damages the credibility of both. Here, though, the blend is more even, more clever, more conducive to the work of building a media empire than to trying to maintain one. Claire's campaign focuses more on Umbrella and on those narrative elements than Leon's does. We get to see what was, for 1998, a pretty complex picture of the villains behind this newly lettered, slightly different G virus. Besides the curveball of the serial killer police chief, these antagonists are more grounded than before. William Birkin and Annette Birkin are scientists who have worked on the virus simply for the professional challenge. When Umbrella comes to claim its property and shoots William, he injects himself with the virus and becomes, a huge Mr. Monster Man. So you've got the T-virus zombies up above and the G-virus boss monsters down below, which is a compelling mix of old and new across the environments. Annette Birkin's characterization mostly revolves around the fact that she is a terrible parent. She has no idea where her kid is, cares more about her work than her daughter's survival, and generally goes out of her way to hinder everyone because she thinks that she knows better. It's kind of a sexist cliche about driven women, and even in 1998 there was criticism about the game's dated gender tropes. It's not egregious, it's just little things that come from a those crazy dames kind of perspective where women are inscrutable, emotional, and fragile. Is Claire a badass? Of course, and so was Jill Valentine in the last game. People talk about sexism in games like it's an either-or kind of thing, and I'm sure I'll hear paragraphs and paragraphs about how it can't possibly and how could I say such a thing. But it's not even a heavy condemnation. I'm just saying that in the grand scheme of things, the game that assumes that Claire would willingly wear pink denim jorts and a black tracksuit out of the house goes on to make some other real dumb assumptions about women. The remake gives Claire something that looks more off-the-shelf and revamps the dialogue considerably, plus to be fair, Leon's get-up is equally clownish here in the 1998 original. Maybe I'd be more sympathetic to the finger-wagging at the bad lady scientist if the daughter, Sherry Birkin, wasn't such an unbearably annoying sidekick character through much of Claire's campaign. If you get too far ahead when she's following you, Sherry will just sit down and pout and wait for you to come back, which is just about the most passive aggression I've put up with from an NPC before. And her voice.
Claire! Are you there?
The ironic thing about it is that the voice acting is much better generally in this installment of Resident Evil. Not up to modern standards, but not nearly as memeably, bafflingly inhuman as most of what was in the first. Sherry is just a low point of dialogue and of tone. By the end of the game, Claire has proven herself to be a worthier mother figure for Sherry, and is driven mostly by a desire to cure Sherry of the virus and free her from the high-concept dysfunction of the elder Birkins. The significance of plot in the early games is less that the games are driven by the narrative, more that a narrative is a necessary tonal component of a grindhouse horror movie, that the blood needs at some point to be briefly interrupted by a dialogue, and if you don't have characters, no one will scream at the monsters. The monologue-laden melodrama of the Birkins isn't meant to provide emotional weight as much as emotional color, a dash of bright operatic tragedy to punctuate the otherwise moody, slow-paced on.
Good hunter, you've done well. The night is near its end. Now, I will show you mercy. You will die, forget the dream, and awake under the morning sun. You will be freed from this terrible hunter's dream. Farewell, my keen hunter. Fear the blood.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
Good. All signed and sealed. Nah, let...